Okay, good morning and welcome everyone. Welcome to our last Reshaping Church Conversation of 2021. In this series, we've been blessed to be facilitated by scholar practitioners leading us through considering ministry leadership in very different and changing times. If you would, please go ahead and introduce yourself in the chat, who you are, where you are, your congregation or organization. And we'd ask that you go ahead and keep yourself muted when you're not speaking. We will have a lot of time for interaction today, but when you're not speaking, that'll help cut down on a little bit of the background noise. So we are blessed today to have with us Reverend Dr. Kadia Edwards, who is a native of St. Catherine, Jamaica, and who answered her call to ministry in 2002 while she was serving as chapel assistant at Andrew Rankin Memorial Chapel at Howard University in Washington, D.C., where she graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in Broadcast Journalism. And then she graduated from Duke Divinity with her Master of Divinity, and most recently earned her Doctor of Ministry degree from Lipscomb University in Nashville. Her Doctor of Ministry concentration in theology, ethics, and narratives informs her multivalent methodological approach to racial healing. Dr. Edwards is licensed and ordained to public ministry in the American Baptist churches and currently serves with American Baptist Home Mission Society. She is a storytelling practitioner and travels around the country facilitating trainings and workshops about storytelling for racial healing. And so we're very blessed to have her with us here today. So will you join me in a virtual welcome of Dr. Edwards while I turn it over to her?
Thank you so much, Jessica. I appreciate the invitation and your friendship, and certainly want to acknowledge Dr. Pam Durso for your presence here and your leadership for Central. So you all have heard a lot this season, right? From this great work that Jessica has been doing with Reshaping Churches. And as Jessica said, I am a storytelling, a diversity, equity, inclusion practitioner. And so I believe in interaction. While I don't mind doing a lecture, I am more of a facilitator. And so I believe in interactions. So I want to kind of spend some time doing some interaction. So you're going to have to talk to each other today. There will be some listening, but there'll also be some talking. And what a great way to kind of get us up and going. I am currently on Atlantic time, I think, so I'm 2 hours ahead of you all. So I've been up for a while, but I'll be hoping to wake some of you up so we can get started. So I want to start just by sharing briefly an opening activity, and then I'll share some about why storytelling for racial healing is so important to me. So when I was in the 11th grade, I grew up in a foster care system. I was born in Jamaica. I came to the United States of America. About the age of 13, I went into the foster care system. And so when I was in about the 10th, 11th grade, I was having conversations with some friends who were talking about college and next steps. For me as a foster kid, my concern was safety and security. I was not thinking about college. I certainly was not thinking about what my future or next steps would be. But I remember hearing how excited they were. And so I decided that I wanted to talk to an adult, a safe adult, I thought, about next steps, about colleges and universities. And so I went to my guidance counselor, who was quite aware of who I am. I mean, I have had some behavioral issues, and so I've been in his office quite a bit. But so I went to talk with him, and I asked him, can we set up a time for us to talk some about colleges and universities, because I want to know where I'll be going, what my grades, what possibilities are there for me with the grades that I have. And my guidance counselor looked me directly in my face and said, Kadia, kids like you don't go to college. Kids like you end up in jail or dead. So this is a story that I was told about my identity as a foster kid. I'm curious, and especially because we're such a small group, to hear a story perhaps, or maybe some ways in which your identity, what stories you've heard about your identities, whether it be your gender, your geographical location, however you identify, what are some stories, good or bad, that you've heard about who you are and how you show up in this world? Feel free to unmute yourself and share as needed. I'm also really good at calling on people, so I'm happy to do that if I need to. So I'll give you one last chance to practice your autonomy and share, but if not, I'm going to call on some folks, right? We have about an hour and a half, so we are going to have to talk and share with each other. You came to a webinar about storytelling. So storytelling is certainly important for this particular webinar.
So I remember being told I couldn't be a pastor because I was a woman, that there weren't any women pastors, that I especially couldn't be one because I was a mom, and there was no way I could be a good mom and be a good pastor at the same time. No one ever told me. I don't have a story about not being able to go to college or not being able to achieve things. I was just told that was one of the things I couldn't be.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jennifer, for sharing that.
I share Jennifer's story when I was a freshman in college and had already sensed a call to ministry, living in Texas in the 1970s, having no imagination in my own life or my family's life of what that could look like. I went to college and discovered in my New Testament class, this is something I could do. I could become a professor and teach. And I was so excited. And I told that to my dad, who was a pastor, a Southern Baptist pastor. And he said, well, you can't do that. And I said, well, why not? He said, well, you know, that's something you have to be called to do, to be a professor of religion. And he never said, you can't do that because you're a girl. But it was certainly under the conversation we were having as part of the subtext of what he was saying to me. So that was pretty direct for him to just say, women can't be called to do any kind of ministry. And it was, when I tell the story, I say, that's the first time in my life that I ever disobeyed my father. I went and changed my major to religion and I graduated, and he has since come along with me on this journey. But he told me I could not have a major in religion. I could not be a professor. I could not be a minister because I was a woman.
Thank
you. Well, I've had a longer life than a lot of you, but I did grow up in a Southern Baptist church, the family that went all the time. And I was baptized when I was 5 or 6 because I knew I didn't want to go to hell. And then it couldn't have been, I don't know, 8 or 9 or 10 sitting in the narthex of Kensington Avenue Baptist Church in Kansas City. I felt God's call, and I immediately thought, well, no, this can't be right, because I don't want to go to Africa. I don't want to be a missionary, because of course this was in the 50s and 60s that I grew up. And in a white suburb since the 6th grade on, no racial differences. I went to a Presbyterian college when I was a Baptist, no Black students. They got one Black girl the year after I graduated. But then I went through getting married and having kids and getting divorced. And my second marriage, when I was, I don't know, around 30, well, he was a Presbyterian. So I started going to the Presbyterian church with him, and I decided that's where I should have been all along. Except, you know, in my head, when they asked me to be a deacon, I thought, my immediate thought was, no, my dad was a deacon. I can't be a deacon. Of course, it's different there. So I did that and kept having, feeling called, but then just ignoring it until I met Judith Todd, who taught Old Testament at Central. And I started at Central the first year that Molly Marshall came. And so she taught the first class on spiritual formation. And I was, and the first book she gave me was Margaret Gunther's Holy Listening. And so I got interested in that part of the spirituality. And, and so I ended up and was ordained Presbyterian minister. And I was just talking about the years 2002, and did interim pastor in the Kansas City area because my family was here. And I started out at Village Presbyterian Church, as the only Presbyterian church I ever belonged to and will. And in the 80s or the 90s, somewhere around there, they had a woman teach a class at Village on something about racism. And so, and I said at the time, I wasn't racist. And I had a Black son-in-law. And I told everybody, if you listened to him on the phone, you wouldn't even know he was Black. He was just like us. And so that's really the first time I started thinking, oh, wait a minute. and I've started learning about the racism part. And I've done a lot of classes on that. And then just this last week, I did a seminar, a webinar with Jane. I caught in the last one, just like I'm catching in the last of this one, on being an anti-racist. So I'm just learning about that. And also last week, I had a storyteller. I heard a storyteller come to a church here in Kansas City and tell the story of a servant, a slave of George and Martha Washington. And she had me spellbound for 45 minutes. I didn't even move. And so that storytelling part is what caught my eye on this also. So I'm trying to, and of course, Jane told us that we're all racist because that's just the way it is. And I want to learn to be an anti-racist, not a non-racist, which of course. So I feel like I've been on this journey for a long time and new things keep coming up. And then when I saw this, I thought, I need to get in on this. So just as of yesterday, I did. So I guess that's my story right now.
Well, thank you, Glenda, and thank you for being here. Anyone else?
I don't recall the original question directly, but when you had mentioned the part about college, that kind of resonated with me. I wasn't in high school. I was not excelling academically, to put it mildly, and I didn't have any behavioral issues either. I was just completely under the radar. I didn't fit into any category. I was in no organizations, no clubs, nothing at all. And nobody was paying any attention to my academics at all or anything. So when it was senior year and we were required to have an exit interview with our counselor. And before that, I had never spoke to the counselor the entire time I was in high school, the advisor, because it wasn't required. They came to an English class every year and they told you to sign up for your classes and we move forward. And I went in, and this was actually a friend of mine's mother. And she did the same thing. I mean, she looked me directly in the face and said, "You're not going to college. There's no, I mean, it's just not for you." And of course, my parents told me, "You have to go to college." And fortunately at that point, and neither one of them had went. My brother and I were the first in our families to go. But neither, fortunately, I think the only real reason I even got into K-State, which is where I went, was at the time they just had open admissions for if you graduated from a Kansas high school. Otherwise, I honestly don't think I probably would have went had I not been able, or without transferring in. And so it really wasn't, because of anything other than kind of, I've always just kind of been that person that people look at and just, they're like, oh, well, he's not going to do this or not going to do that. And, I was always told, just kind of in the system in which I grew up, oh, you can be anything you want to be. You can do anything you want to do. But there was always the caveat of, but you have to have a backup plan. Don't get your heart too set on that. You have to have a backup plan. So my entire life, I have gone through thinking, well, what I actually want to do will never really happen. So that's me.
Thank you. All right, I am going to assume that those who wanted to share had the opportunity to do so, and so they did. Glenda, do you have a question?
No, I don't have a question. I forgot one part. I forgot
Okay.
the college part.
Okay.
I was one of 5 children, and my sister went to Warrensburg, and I knew I didn't want to go to Warrensburg. And I was a good student, and I was salutatorian of my class, but I didn't want to go. I don't know. I got a job in Kansas City, but then a friend went to Lindenwood at my mother's age. And so she got me into Lindenwood College in St. Charles, which was Presbyterian when I was still a Baptist. That's God's sense of humor. And so I went to 4 years of college, but I knew I had to get a job. And so I did what I knew how to do. And I got out of there with my degree in business administration and became a secretary. And so it's just to me, it's very interesting that, and I found out later that some man in Kansas City paid for my first year, and then I worked and got scholarships and did loans to get through. And so it was like I had a chance to do something more, but then I kind of went back to being safe, but then I ended up, like I say, my husband died the first year that we started at Central together, and then he died, and I continued, and he would have got us out in 3 years. And I took 6 years and got 2 masters. So I did it my way.
Thank you, I appreciate that. I saw a question in the chat, and Jessica, thanks for answering. I just, James wanted to say, what story about your identity or an identity that you've heard about yourself? So just I don't know if you were asking that because you wanted to share, but happy to give you that opportunity to do so now. Okay, so the reason I started with this icebreaker is because there are historical narratives that tells us who we are or tells us about our neighbors. So something lived within my guidance counselor that said, you're a foster child with behavioral issues, and so therefore college and a hopeful future is not something that is for you. What's for you is jail or death. I wanted to touch briefly on something Craig said, because it highlights the point that I'm making, which Craig said that he's always heard, right? Like that you will have a future, right? There are certain people that are among us that are told that you are expected to have a future. You're expected to be the one, I'm sorry, I apologize. You're expected to be the one to be successful. You're expected to be this, and because of the way that person may look, because of how that person may identify. And those of us that are in marginalized spaces or show up in marginalized identities may hear completely different stories. And so just to kind of give you a background of what led me to sort of find a passion around storytelling is about 2-3 years ago, I was invited to serve as a conflict transformation trainer and a professor with the Youth Theology Institute at Lipscomb University, where I graduated with my doctorate degree. And so I worked with about 75 students over the 2 summers around narratives, around storytelling, around what today folks are calling critical race theory. So we spent 10 days with them, and 3 of those 10 days we spent touring civil rights museums in the South, more specifically in Alabama. And one of the things that I required the students to write as a pre-narrative is to share a story about the first time they became aware of their race. And so I asked the students to do this, having sent them pre-work. So they had to read about 125 pages of different authors, specifically authors of color, hearing their stories, Ta-Nehisi Coates, Between the World and Me, Michael Eric Dyson, a few others. And so the requirement is that they would have to come to class and be prepared to share their stories. I was completely blown away with these young people and the stories that they've heard about who they are and how they're supposed to be. It's also helpful to note that we had a very mixed group of students. So all of the stories are not just about students being told who they could not be, but also students being told who they were supposed to be because they identify as a white student or because of what they've heard about their neighbors. And so I kind of got the thought, this is really powerful, and I want people to hear what our students are hearing, whether it be from their parents, whether it be from institutions, whether it be from the media. We need to hear what our young people are hearing. If they are our future, and I want to be in very capable hands in the future, I certainly want my children to be in capable hands in the future. That means that we should be talking about the stories that live within us and the stories that we are telling and perpetrating on each other. And so I asked them to do a post narrative of the program that they went through. And so that's what I turned into a project to kind of analyze and spend some time thinking about what I heard from about 30 students. And so some of the points that you'll hear here today came specifically from what I did in my research with these young people. At this time, I want to kind of, Jessica, I'm gonna ask you to play the video that I have, and then I'll come back and I'll lift up those points, specifically to the video, but also to what I've heard from the students, and hopefully we'll talk some more about that.
I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS. unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become. The single story creates stereotypes, and the problem with stereotypes is not that they are untrue, but that they are incomplete. They make one story become the only story. It is impossible to talk about the single story without talking about power. How they are told, who tells them, when they are told, how many stories are told, are really dependent on power. Power is the ability not just to tell the story of another person, but to make it the definitive story of that person. I grew up under repressive military governments that devalued education so that sometimes my parents were not paid their salaries. And so as a child, I saw jam disappear from the breakfast table. Then margarine disappeared. Then bread became too expensive. Then milk became rationed. And most of all, a kind of normalized political fear invaded our lives. All of these stories make me who I am. But to insist on only these negative stories is to flatten my experience and to overlook the many other stories that formed me. The consequence of the single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. It emphasizes how we are different rather than how we are similar. Stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. I would like to end with this thought, that when we reject the single story, when we realize that there is never a single story about any place, we regain a kind of paradise. Thank you.
Latest studies have.
Thank you, Jessica. I appreciate that. So I want to share now about what I've learned from my time with these young people about storytelling. And again, would love to hear some thoughts. So feel free as I am sharing, if you have any questions, to put it in the chat and I will engage as needed. But so we just watched a video by Chimamanda Adichie about the danger of a storytelling. And what she's sharing is how when we have these stereotypes about people, I love what she said, that it's not necessarily that stereotypes are untrue as much as they are incomplete. And so the young people, having visited these civil rights museums, having spent time in listening to each other's stories, helped me to understand that storytelling is I apologize about that. So that storytelling is important for us to retain the importance of sharing our stories in communities, to prevent the perpetuations of false narratives about our neighbors. If you've been watching the media recently, you'll notice that, or even if you've been reading anything, you'll notice that we are living in the grand narrative of white supremacy. And so if we accept the media's claims based on what we see or read, then we make assumptions that are founded, that are not founded in evidence. Sharing our stories in communities open us up to a space of empathy to take root. It helps us to hear authentically from each other, where we allow for vulnerability to take place. Storytelling often feels as though we're living, storytelling often allow us to hear each other in a way that we don't get to when we're listening to just the media. Oftentimes when you're hearing or seeing what's happening in the news, you're hearing a different narrative of who I am. You're hearing a different narrative of your neighbor, because that is what's being perpetuated. Something that I've been thinking of recently is the way that Kyle Rittenhouse is portrayed as a young 17-year-old boy who needed to defend himself from a group of domestic terrorists, as they're saying, or attackers that was trying to take his life. And yet several years ago, there was another young 17-year-old who was walking home with a bottle of iced tea and a bag of Skittles, just trying to make his way to his father's home in Florida. And he was murdered by a neighborhood watch vigilante. And that particular individual was painted as a man. He was painted as someone who was scary. He was painted as someone who deserved to die. And so when we listen to certain narratives, especially those that are coming from some of the media outlets that we're listening to, you will hear stories that are telling you to fear and hate your neighbors, rather than listening to a variety of people that can create a sense of camaraderie and friendship. I heard a recent quote from a pastor, and I thought it was just absolutely profound. It says, a 30-minute sermon won't teach people to love their neighbors if their cable news teaches them all week to fear or hate. They've already been discipled. Another thing that I learned is that there are historical narratives that tells us, I apologize, my mouse is doing something scary over here. There are historical narratives that are told within mainstream discourse that continue to silence other narratives that are actively underrepresented. And the reason I opened up with the activity I did is because I wanted us to hear some of those historical narratives. There are narratives that says women cannot pastor, right? There are narratives that tells us that one of the things that Glenda said that I appreciated, and she pointed out as an awareness for her, is the language of, if you listen to him, he doesn't sound Black. And so what does that mean? How does a Black person sound? So to be able to kind of bring these narratives together, to be able to hear from the person that your stereotype is telling you about, to hear their story, should be able to perhaps create some empathy. One of the examples that I have here is we're often taught to honor the peacemaking efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. But we're also taught to disregard Martin's continued activism of civil disobedience and Jim and Jane Crow laws and unjust treatment of African Americans and poor people in the South. So we want to talk about the nonviolence. I always find it fascinating that people are willing to quote Martin Luther King Jr. around nonviolence quote, but they're not willing to speak to the fact that he was an activist. And was very clear about those things that he stood for. Similarly, we're taught to fight for the eradication of gender-based violence. But we neglect, especially as Christians, especially as people in the church, we neglect to hear stories about the violence that is inflicted upon Black and Brown women, as well as queer and transgendered women in this country. Many Black and Brown transgendered women have been murdered, yet due to their identity, their stories are often untold and unheard. So in equity work, we must optimize every opportunity we are given to amplify the voices and stories of people who've been forced to the margins and made vulnerable by the very systems we seek to demolish. It's also important for us to retain the importance of sharing our stories in communities to prevent the perpetuations of false narratives about our neighbors. The other thing that we must do it is important for people of color, for BIPOC, Black, Indigenous people of color, to continue to share and create spaces for their stories and voices to be amplified. If not, they can easily be silenced by the false narratives of the dominant culture. According to author Brenda McNeil, we also must learn when and how to tell our stories and help others to tell theirs. Sometimes we need to do the talking, but many times we need to ensure instead that others are being heard. By passing the mic to underrepresented voices, we humanize the narrative, the hearing, the telling, and the interpreting the stories with integrity so that different communities can understand and learn from each other. When the mic is not passed, there's a risk of silencing and erasing the voices of groups that are already oppressed and disenfranchised. In an op-ed a few months ago, I believe it was back in June, Tom Hanks wrote, "This history is mostly written by white people about white people like him, while the history of Black people was too often left out." Tom Hanks suggested that Black history and the societal impact of racism is underrepresented in the entertainment industry and the American education system. And how interesting that we're even trying to go further by just allowing students not to learn about the history of what have taken place in the United States of America, because we've now politicized history and we're not even willing to teach. We're fighting about what critical race theory is just because we don't want students to learn. Storytelling also has the power to facilitate and create empathy. It can transform and create a sense of personal empowerment and healing. One example is the #MeToo movement. We have seen many men move from a place of complicity to actively engage in supporting women in this campaign. According to a report on CNN.com, the #MeToo campaign has energized over 4.7 million people around the world who've engaged in the Me Too conversation with more than 12 million posts, comments, and reactions. Similarly, Facebook has also reported that more than 45% of people in the United States are friends with someone who has posted a message with the words, "Me Too." Storytelling also provides opportunities for critical self-reflection and enhanced knowledge of who we are, who our neighbors are, and who God is. Through listening to others' story, we become more aware of how institutions perpetuate micro and macroaggressions. Storytelling helps enhance our self-awareness to identify our privilege while providing an avenue for us to challenge the lies, misconceptions, and false narratives that we carry within ourselves about each other. Sharing our stories helps to build authentic relationships. If stories from scriptures provide a guide for the Christian journey, right? We experience our lives as narratives. This helps us to understand ourselves and others as a part of God's story. We cannot help be informed by the narratives we tell ourselves every day, and by those narratives that are being told to us about each other. And lastly, storytelling is a critical tool to combat racist narratives, systemic racism, and discrimination. Stories heal and transform communities. Stories are an integral part of any approach to peace building. They're important for understanding histories that are unspoken and integral to trust building and trust rebuilding when trust has been broken. Storytelling leads to decentering dominant and false narratives. It critiques and can help dismantle the myth of white supremacy. Storytelling creates empathy among people that have different circumstances and lives we will never understand. Simply, storytelling transforms us. So storytelling is a catalyst for action and impetus to move beyond complicity. It is imperative for individuals to move beyond guilt to a place of action, and through sharing our stories in places where truth-telling and courageous conversations can happen. In exchanges marked by vulnerability and authenticity, storytelling becomes a means for action. As Christians, we're peacemakers, And storytelling should bring us from a place of conflict into a place of racial healing. As we look at this current political climate, we're living in the narrative of white supremacy. If we desire to move beyond these narratives and injustices, we must create opportunities for stories to aid in healing our relationships, our communities, our churches, and our nation. The church is holy ground for the work of racial healing through storytelling. As Christians, we are story people. Jesus used stories to impact change. The Bible is the grand narrative that communicates what God is doing in and through God's creation. Too often, the American Christian church has contributed to racial injustice. As author Jamar Tisby explained, historically speaking, when faced with the choice between racism and equality, the American church has tended to practice a complicit Christianity rather than a courageous Christianity. They choose the comfort over constructive conflict, and in so doing, created and maintained a status quo of injustice. It is time for the church to be a part of this racial healing. To do so, we must rewrite the American story of white supremacy. Pastor Bill Lamar of the Metropolitan AME Church wrote in an article a few months ago, directed to the Proud Boys after they destroyed the Black Lives Matter outside of his church. Only a new narrative can change the way we order this society. This new narrative must question everything if we are serious about imagining a better world. I want to end this piece before we engage a little bit more in conversation by sharing a video. And I want to just say that the video, there are some curse words. It's really quick, but I want to share that, and then I will share one of the stories from my students, and hopefully we'll be able to engage more in some conversations. Jessica, do you mind unmuting and let me know if you're seeing what I'm sharing?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to, I share that because I want to finish with this story from my student, so that we can hear where some of our young people are hearing these stories. And oftentimes we like to think it's coming just from an outside source, but sometimes it's coming from the things that we say. And I want to preference before I read, just to let you know that I received permission from the student to share. And so the names have certainly been changed, but the story is true. So this was written in July 2017. And again, I asked each student to write a pre-narrative around the first time they became aware of their race. So I was 10 years old and in the 4th grade. I was enrolled in an elementary school in Williamson County, Tennessee, a mile from my house, surrounded by people who looked just like me, just like my siblings, just like my parents, except all of them had much more money. I didn't understand the ideas of systemic or societal racism, as many white fourth graders don't, and still will never be able to firsthand understand anything under the subject for the obvious reason of being, well, white. My parents always taught me that love was the main force that drives the world, an all-inclusive love that Jesus had practiced. I knew this from the moment I began school, to always practice the acceptance and tolerance that I had learned from the Bible, that I read as soon as I knew how. I have and never will experience racism from the oppressed side, but fourth grade me heard the words spoken by my friend's mom. 3 of my fellow 10-year-olds were more than excited to get to go to the mall together for the first time. We knew we couldn't go alone, so the newest member of our group volunteered her mom as chaperone. As we set off store after store, we approached one called Wet Seal, a self-described as a brand for edgy women, but most white people describe it as urban with a semi-disgusted tone. The mom who bought us was much more open about her vocabulary. I remember the next few moments so clearly. As we walked in the store, her daughter picked out a shirt and she quickly took it from her hands and put it back. Sweetie, we cannot buy this shirt. This is where the Blacks and Mexicans shop, were the exact words that left the middle-aged woman's mouth. I don't remember much else about the mall trip, only the aftermath. A disclaimer, my mom is not one to get involved with drama at all, especially involving other moms or school, etc. I immediately told her about what was said, and she called the fellow mom to talk. The way my mom reacted and took action planted a passion in me that still remains today. Although I was too young to understand the severity of the situation, I will never forget what was said, and the event itself led me to pay more attention to the way minorities as a whole are treated. The overall experience set me up for a lifelong passion for serving those underprivileged in society. As I got older, the drive I had stayed with me. When Trayvon Martin's death became public, an even greater change within me occurred. We are all taught men are created equal and racism is bad, but it never really hits home for people until they let it. It seems so hard for the privileged to understand that others get mistreated in the United States. And it never rang clearer to me that when I realized an innocent teenager can be killed for the color of his skin, forget the trial, forget the politics, forget the outcome, forget opinions around it, forget the privilege, and just for a second, let it in that a 17-year-old was killed for no valid reason. The worst part is he isn't the only one killed from injustice. Last July, I went to a vigil in March supporting the Black Lives Matter movement and memorial for Philando Castile. I understand that my shared beliefs with the BLM community can be strong and intimidating to some, especially around the church. As stated before, I was taught from a young age to never let a voice go unheard and love like Jesus in all I do. Sometimes doing that can be scary and upsetting to many. In the country I live in, which I love and support, not all voices are heard. Fortunately, being who I am, mine is. So I will use mine to help those around me who are crying out for it, not making the situations they face about me or my skin color. I wish I could spare the feelings of those who disagree, but the power of love can and will hopefully become the battles love can and will hopefully overcome the battles going on. So I want to kind of invite some vulnerability. That's part of the reason why I shared the different pieces of what storytelling can do. And Jessica, if it's okay, I'll probably ask you to pause the recording.
So we're so grateful for your wisdom, for your willingness to condense your entire dissertation into an hour and a half for us. But I hope it's also not the last time we get to engage with you and with your work. Really grateful for who you are and what you do in the world and what you've brought for us today. So will you all join me in giving a special virtual thank you and shout out to Dr. Edwards? And just one quick word about Reshaping Church. For those of you that may have registered for our October Reshaping Church conversation with Reverend Susan Sparks that got postponed, that has been rescheduled to Thursday, January 13th at 9:30 a.m. It's on Preaching Punchlines. And so I'll send out an email with updated information about that for everyone. Also, in that email, you can look for an opportunity to participate in a special program that we're starting in 2022 as part of Reshaping Church. And it's for congregational leaders, clergy or lay leaders, to be part of a congregational leadership collective in the early part of 2022. So, and this is through Central's Reshaping Church Thriving Congregations program. So I'll have more information in an email that will go out to everyone who attended any of the Reshaping Church Conversation webinars, and an evaluation form to help us learn what was helpful and useful about this series so that we can plan for next year as well. So again, huge thank you to Dr. Edwards, and I just am personally so grateful to have the chance to connect with you and build friendship with you through this process too. And prayers and blessings on your mission trip. And thank you all for being here today. Stay safe and healthy, and a happy Thanksgiving to everyone.